Obituaries of your ancestors can reveal a whole boatload of information. You might not have realized that, but yes, it really can. We're going to talk about that right after this. Thanks for joining me again, fellow roadie. It's so nice to have you back here again. Thanks so much for watching. Hey, listen, we're going to continue our series on death and death-related records. Just a goldmine of information. And today, we're talking about obituaries. Now, you might wonder, what are some of the kinds of information that you can find in an obituary? Well, here's a list. And this is not comprehensive by any means. But first of all, a maiden name. If it's a woman who died, it may show her maiden name, or it may not. It'll show when they died, the death date. Now, that may or may not be there. They might just say that, Joe Smith, 82 years old, died yesterday. Okay, that's not going to give a specific date, but if you know when the newspaper was published, then, well, you can figure that out. Just pull up a calendar from 1952. They're available all over, at least in the example we're going to give, 1952, where they died, their birth date, maybe, the birthplace, when they were married, their spouse's name, which may just be a first name, or it could be her first name and her married last name, or it might have the full maiden name there. It can also show what occupation the deceased had, residences, different places they lived, when he immigrated, if he did, if he was an immigrant, it might say where he came from, and it might be just very generally. It might just say he came from Germany. It might give you a year, it might not. The names of his children, what religion or church he was associated with, where he was buried, and even when he was buried. So these are a lot of clues that can be in an obituary. But of course, not all of these are going to show up in every obituary, not by any means. You'll be lucky. If you're lucky, all this stuff will be in an obituary. But hey, let's take a look at a sample obituary and go through it. And I'll show you the different kinds of stuff that show up in an obituary. Okay, here's an obituary for a fellow named Frank W. Yost. Now, this was taken from the Idaho Daily Statesman. That's a newspaper in Boise, Idaho, and it was their Tuesday, November 11th, 1952 edition. And I'll tell you how I found that later, but okay, so here we are. Frank W. Yost, Caldwell, dies. Well, it says he died. Well, first of all, it says he's 78 years old. Now, like I said, sometimes an obituary may only have the age of the person who died. So you'll need to backtrack from 1952 and see what year he died. And it says he lived in Caldwell, that is in Idaho, and that he was a pioneer Idaho resident, and that he died Monday afternoon at a Caldwell hospital. Now, they might not give a specific date that he died, or they might even give a specific date that he died. In this case, it was Monday afternoon, and this was a Tuesday edition of the newspaper, so you know, since this was from November 11th, that he died on November 10th. There you go. Now, let's continue on. Mr. Yost was born March 2nd, 1874. So, okay, you don't have to guess here. They give you a very specific date. And that he was born in Carrolltown, Pennsylvania. And he learned the blacksmithing trade at an early age, probably in Carrolltown, Pennsylvania. or I know that that is in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, so probably somewhere in Cambria County, Pennsylvania. Now it says he came west in 1895. Okay, right there. Mr. Yost at this point was 21 years old. That's pretty young. He went out west, it said, and spent 4 years at Spokane and Colfax, Washington. Now, why did he go all the way across the country to Washington State from Pennsylvania? These are the kind of questions you need to ask yourself. And that might spur some further research for you to do too. Okay, so he said he spent 4 years, these two places in Washington, before he went to the Buffalo Hump Country near Elk City, Idaho, where he worked 9 years in the mines. Now, this just seemed very strange to me. What is this Buffalo Hump Country? Now, I don't think it's another country outside the United States, since it says it's near this place, this Elk City in Idaho. But I did look this up, and it turns out that this Buffalo Hump Country is a region there in Idaho which is known for its coal mines. So even though it doesn't say what kind of mines he worked, we can probably safely assume that they were coal mines. And he worked there for 9 years. Then he moved to the Coeur d'Alene mining area, and that's in Idaho too. You would need to look that up. But while he was there, he married in 1909 to Ellen Furlong. And there you have his wife's maiden name. But wait a minute, is that really her maiden name? What if she was married before this? And that's still the surname of her previous husband. You have to do some more research for that. Now, the couple settled at Kellogg in 1912. Now, I'm assuming that's in Idaho, but we don't know. More research. So they settled there in 1912, and he opened a blacksmith shop and garage. So he's going back. He stopped mining, and he opened this going back to that skill of blacksmithing. So blacksmith shop and garage, because I guess automobiles are starting to gain popularity. So he opened this business until soon after Mrs. Yost's death in 1931. So we know then that Ellen died in 1931. Great information, great information. So now it says Mr. Yost returned to the Buffalo Hump Country and spent several years there before he retired. Now, we don't know what he was doing in this area they're calling Buffalo Hump Country, but he may have returned to mining again. So he retired, and when he retired, he has since resided in Portland, Boise, and Caldwell. Now, we know Caldwell was in Idaho. We know Boise is in Idaho, but what about Portland? I did a check online, and I could not find a Portland, Idaho. So maybe he was in Portland, Oregon. All kinds of questions. Gives you a lot of information, but also raises a lot more questions, which is good too, because it gives you lots of clues. It says he was a member of the Catholic Church. There's another big one. You know what religion he belonged to, so you can possibly check church records if you need to. Then it gives the names of his surviving children. There's 2 daughters. The only problem is they didn't give the first names of these daughters. They're listed as Mrs. Claude H. Studebaker. Now, and she's in Boise at the time. we know then that obviously she was married to Mr. Claude H. Studebaker, but we don't know what her first name is. Another daughter is Mrs. Charles E. Wilson. Once again, not giving her proper first name. And she lives in Pocatello. And 6 grandchildren also survive him. So yeah, sometimes they'll do this. Sometimes when they give women's names, then if they're married, they'll just say Mrs. and then the name of their husband. So that can be tough. But that's another clue. We can look in census records and see if we can look for Claude Studebaker and Charles E. Wilson in Idaho and see if it lists their wife's first name. And it should if they're in the census records. Then it says they're going to have a mass at St. John's Catholic Cathedral. Now, is that the church he attended? We don't know that. We know he was Catholic, and we know this is a Catholic church, but is that the one he actually attended? We don't know that. It might be a church that one of his daughters attends. We just don't know. Then it tells you he's going to be buried at Spokane, Washington. Spokane, Washington. Why Spokane, Washington? That was one of the cities he first went to when he left Pennsylvania. It says up top there that he spent 4 years after he came out west. He spent 4 years at Spokane and Colfax, Washington. You know, once again, we don't know why he went all the way from Pennsylvania across the country to Washington State. We just don't know. Did he know someone there? Was there a family member or maybe more than one family member that lived there? We just don't know. Another question you have to ask yourself when you see these obituaries: where did all this information come from? It obviously didn't come from Frank Yost. It didn't come from his wife because she was already deceased. So then, how do we know how accurate this information is? I don't know. Did Frank share this information with his daughters? Did he write something up about what he did? Was he keeping a journal, a diary of some kind? We just don't know. So it's hard to tell how accurate. I mean, you would think because it's so specific that it is probably accurate. But we don't know that for sure. We just don't know. And once again, we don't know who provided this information. Now, it has the name of his one daughter there, Mrs. Studebaker. So something I did and that you can do when you find an obituary, if you wonder who provided this information, what I did was, I'm not going to show it here, but I did find his death certificate on Ancestry.com. And if you remember, if you've already watched that video on death certificates, much of the time, there will be listed on there the name of the person who provided information about the deceased on there. So who provided information for his death certificate? Well, you know what? It was Mrs. Studebaker. So my first guess would be that that's who provided information for the obituary too. We have no proof of that. But that would be my guess. If she's the one who provided information for the death certificate, it's probably a good guess that she provided the information for the obituary. We'll never know that, but it's a good guess. Let's move on to where we're going to find these obituaries. Where do we look for them? Here are some places where you can find obituaries. One of them that a lot of people don't even think about is findagrave.com. Now, we talked about findagrave.com under the cemetery records video. You can find a link to all the previous videos I did on death and death-related sources down below in the description. People normally go there just to see what grave they might be buried in. And yeah, you can do that. It might even have a photo of their marker at the grave. But sometimes people will attach a digital copy of their obituary on there. Great stuff, but a place people don't think to look. Now, the second one really is my go-to source for finding obituaries. It's a site called newspapers.com. This is a subscription website, which falls under Ancestry.com. But if you have an Ancestry.com subscription, that doesn't cover newspapers.com. Newspaper.com has newspapers from all over the place. Obviously, not all the newspapers in the country. You might not find your newspapers there. But what you can do is you can use that site for free. And I think they normally change the number of days you get for free, whether it's 7 days, 14 days, I'm not sure. But check it out, because then you can go in and take a look at any obituaries that you need to find. But if you can do that without subscribing, then you need all the information for all the obituaries you think you want to find during that free trial. That's just a great source. Like I said, that has been my go-to. Other places you can go to are city, county, and state organizations. And by those, I mean historical or genealogical societies. Now, in cities, it's probably only large cities that would have one devoted just to the city. There's a lot of them that have county historical and genealogical organizations. Sometimes they combine them into one. And don't have two separate ones for history and genealogy. Because lots of times they will actually have microfilm of the old newspapers. Of course, the only problem with that is, and it's also true of the state organizations, the problem with that is if you don't know when they died, then that's going to be very, very tough. Very tough. Finally, the library. Same thing. If it's a library in the area where you know they died or believe they died, they may also have the local newspapers on microfilm there. But then, once again, that's the main problem, is that if you don't know when they died, well, I mean, even if you know the year, you believe me, it's going to take you forever to scroll through a year's worth of newspapers. It's a little easier if it's just a weekly newspaper. But daily newspapers, oh my goodness, that's tough. That's the good thing about newspapers.com. You can put in someone's name and it'll pop up with all instances where that person's name came up in the newspapers that they have on their site. Now they can still give a lot more results than what you want, but you can also specify a state and even a county within the state. So much more efficient than scrolling through a bunch of microfilm. Like it says, if you know where he died, then you can go to those other organizations, the genealogical and historical societies, the local libraries, and I'm sure there's several other places where you may be able to go. And I should point out, too, that city and county, well, I'll say county because I know for a fact that one of the county historical and genealogical societies that I went to very often has a obituary file, and it's sorted by surname, where they actually cut out obituaries from the newspapers and put the date that the obituary appeared in the newspaper. Now, they've only been doing that, this specific organization has only been doing that for maybe 30, 40 years, certainly no more than 50 years, I don't think. And some counties might not be as diligent in putting the date on those obituaries. They might just have the raw obituary. And while we're on the subject, an obituary that I found when I was 14 years old is what started me on doing my family history. But that's a story for another day. So, hey, I hope this was helpful for you. Leave a comment down below. to let me know what you thought and any experiences you've had in researching your ancestors' obituaries. I'm telling you, there's a great amount of information, and you should really check them out. And all those pieces go together: the obituaries, the cemetery records, the census records, the death certificates. It's just incredible. It's real detective work, but it's worth it. It's worth it to find this vital information about your ancestors, who they were, where they lived, maybe how they died. So hang in there, check it out, keep the faith, and I'll see you next time on the road to your family history.